Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session on political campaigning of the Progressive Governance Symposium 2020. This session is on the future of campaigning and campaigning for the future. I'm Matt Browne, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and also the founder and director of Global Progress. I'll be chairing today's session, but we've got a fantastic lineup of campaigners and political experts joining us today. First, we have Ismaël Emelien, who is one of the co-founders of Marche, helped lead the campaign and also served as advisor to President Macron in the Elysee. We have Gainey, who is the executive director of the Gainey Foundation, but is also the past president of the Liberal Party of Canada and one of the senior figures behind the rise of Justin Trudeau, both as leader of the Liberal Party of Canada and now as Prime Minister of Canada. We also have Robert Heinrich, who's the head of the office of the chairs of Bündnis 90, I hope I pronounced that correctly, or Die Grünen, the Green Party of Germany. And we have Muthoni Wambu Kraal, who is the national political and organizing director of the Democratic National Committee in the United States. So a fantastic group of people here to sort of talk about some of the issues we have today. For those of you who are interested, and let's move to the next slide, there was also an edited volume published by Global Progress today, Insurgents, which you might want to download. We'll be sharing a link via the website. This is a free pamphlet for you to look at, and it charts the rise of Jacinda Ardern, Justin Trudeau, Emmanuel Macron, György Karsoni in Hungary, and Matteo Renzi. Each of the chapters are written by campaign insiders, and what we try to do is draw some lessons out about how to do politics, not so much lessons on the content of their politics, although we do touch upon that, but really on the actual politics, their process of doing politics, their philosophy behind how they organize their movement. So please do take a look at that, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Just to set the scene, I thought I would share a little bit of data about the kind of moment that we're in before we go to the panelists. I think it's fair to say, as we look at the opinion data across Europe, but also in the US, that while many of us feel like we're into a period of easing of the social distancing measures, the crisis is far from over. And whether you're in France, whether you're in the UK, the United States or Germany, many people still feel that the worst is still to come. That's both in terms of the return of a second spike, a second rise in the pandemic, but also in terms of how society has to deal with the economic, social and political consequences, as well as the health consequences of the coronavirus. Let's move to the next slide as well, please, Alex. What we see as well is that across our societies, people are beginning to question globalization in some way, or at least questioning whether now is not a time for their societies to be cut off from the rest of the world more than they had been. This is what, so people are increasingly nervous about that, particularly in terms of economic globalization. We hear calls for people to insource, for example, essential products. President Macron gave a speech recently on that, but also their relative, with the exception of France, their relative openness to migrants and refugees is also in question. On the positive side, then, when we look at democracy, let's move to the next slide, please, Alex. Feelings towards democracy are generally improving. In all countries, the numbers are up, although people feel less positive in France about the performance of democracy in the government at this time in comparison to Germany and the UK. And the UK number might seem surprising to many, given the poor performance that the Johnson government has shown during the corona crisis, though. Now let's have a look at some of the issues on the next slide that people seem to be concerned about, and in particular the importance of climate change. It has been notable during a lot of these discussions during the Progressive Governance Symposium, but also in general progressive discussions, that people have often felt the COVID-19 crisis, the recovery from it, presents an opportunity for climate. Well, is that true? Well, what we do see now, if you look at this green line, is that climate is much lower on the list of issues that people seem to care about in comparison to budget debt and deficit, and also in comparison to where it was 2 or 3 years ago, although it still remains a reasonably high priority. But what is clear is, as we move to the next slide, what is clear is that when it comes to the relationship between environment and the economy, people are overwhelmingly in favor of ensuring that any action on the environment must not be to the detriment of economic growth. That is to say, people feel that yes, they want the environment to improve, but it must be integrated fully into an economic recovery that creates jobs in the main. So, you know, this sort of leads to a question really, and this will be the first question for the panel, about what are the opportunities out there? You know, there was a great deal of talk, let's turn to the next slide, Alex. There was a great deal of talk in the early days about how our societies had come together, that the COVID crisis had meant that we were all living very similar and shared experiences, and that as a consequence of that, there would be greater unity and greater opportunity for progressive change. Yet what we are beginning to see already is the emergence of a number of tensions, or the re-emergence of tensions that existed prior to the crisis. That is tensions between blue and white collar workers and those on the front line. That is tensions and differences in behavior between the younger generation and the older generation, between men and women. Women have been impacted actually much more profoundly by this crisis than others, than men have. For example, they have been furloughed more, or have actually been made unemployed more than others, but they've also had to take on a greater share, our research shows, than a greater share of the homeschooling and the caring than men. And then there are also the tensions between the urban centers and the rural areas that have had differential impact of the crisis. So those were tensions that were beginning to emerge that say that perhaps society wasn't coming together in quite the way, or wouldn't stay together in quite the way that people had hoped. And then, of course, we had the senseless and brutal murder of George Floyd at the hands of police. So let's move to the next slide, please, Alex. And so what we've seen in the middle of this pandemic, in the middle of this crisis, is a second crisis, where the racial tensions and racial inequalities have been brutally exposed. Now, you know, in the United States, this has focused around police brutality and the killing of Black Americans by the police. Although it's also notable to say that across our country, certainly in the UK, but elsewhere, minorities, ethnic minorities and visible minorities have suffered more from the crisis than others. And as a new tension that we see emerging as we move to the final slide is that this is being shaped by the right, but also by some on the left, as a culture war. A growing debate focused much less sometimes around the actual inequalities, the racial inequalities that exist in our society and how we tackle them, and much more around issues of symbol about past and identity. And of course, the debates about which statues should be allowed to remain and which statues should be pulled down or replaced or put in museums is an indicator of that. So that sort of leads me to my opening question for the for our panel, which is, where do we go from here? Are we in a moment where there is greater opportunity for progressive change? Are we in a moment where we will return to existing tensions between people who had different visions of the future and had different political values? And that's where I'd like to start this panel and go to Anna Gainey, who I said earlier when I introduced her is the president of the Gainey Foundation, but also the past president of the Liberal Party of Canada. Anna, welcome. The floor is yours, and I just love your views on where are we going to go from here? What are the likely consequences and the likely trajectories coming out of this crisis?
So, big, important questions, Matt. Thank you for inviting me to join you and this panel this afternoon here in Montreal. Happy to be with all of you. You know, I think what's interesting from the Canadian perspective is, you know, you were touching on a lot of European data and slides, and then we were focused a little bit on the situation in the United States, in particular around the racial inequality and injustice that's come to the forefront within the context of the health crisis. And here, I think I would say that there are parallel trends and issues. this party, this government campaigned on some of the things you talked about, both in 2015 and 2019. We've just come out of a cycle, an election cycle here, where climate, economic inequality, and social issues, in particular, I would say here on our front would be on Indigenous and Indigenous issues in particular. The Prime Minister's focus on reconciliation, where much has been done, but clearly much remains to be done. And what we've seen in the US has popped up here as well, more visibly in recent weeks with similar tragedies and incidents with Indigenous men and women and the RCMP. So there's a heightened awareness, and people are tuned in, and they're protesting as well here. And so I feel in some ways that it's highlighted, but at the same time, these are issues that I think this country expected this Prime Minister to tackle and to deal with, even prior to COVID. And the trick will be continuing to focus on those issues while managing this health crisis, which doesn't appear to be really going away quickly. I think it's going to be with us for a long period of time. And I think that Canadians' attention will increasingly focus, as you've pointed out, on the economic question, like the money that the government has injected into our economy in support of families and artists and all sectors of the economy, from tourism and regional issues. There's been a lot of money going out, and the question will become, as the pressure mounts to bring Parliament back in person, how are we going to handle that financially? And it'll be a challenge here to keep focused on those progressive issues in that context, and to continue to make the case for climate and these things, while showing and demonstrating that progressives can deal with this economic issue, can deal with this health issue, and not lose sight of the bigger picture, those issues that were here before the health crisis arrived and will persist in the wake of that. So I think your point too on women and children and also seniors' homes here, that while it's a provincial jurisdiction, there will be pressure federally from progressives to really take a hard look at those particular domains that have been impacted and have really brought to the forefront how important caregivers are in our society, and probably how undervalued they are in some cases, and that we'll need to be taking, as progressives, a real serious look at that, and in the Canadian context, working very closely with provinces to try to advance and show some leadership for change on those two fronts.
Great, thank you very much, Anna. Let me just turn now to Robert Heinrich from the German Green Party. Robert, your sort of view on where are we going to go from here? Is this a historic moment for advancing causes around climate? And if so, how do we do that effectively as progressive campaigners? But of course, please do feel free to touch on any of the other issues that we're discussing here. Welcome, Robert.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here and setting up this very interesting panel. I would like to start just with saying that in Germany, we are in a weird situation at the moment, because we are in the middle of the crisis, where the crisis is not over. We are maybe just at the start of an economic crisis and in the middle of a health crisis. Although at the same time, the numbers of infections are going down and are very low level. So this is a kind of, it feels this summer feels both very normal again, but very unnormal, knowing that we're in the middle of it. So just these two sentences in advance. I'd like to jump in your question, Matt. Is this crisis maybe also a defining moment, an opportunity maybe for progressive issues? This is what I understood, and I would say maybe, because we are, and this sounds, we said this before a lot of times, but this time I think it's really true. We are in a way at the crossroads, because when we think at the last big world crisis, the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, what happened there? First, Obama won the election. And second, Angela Merkel won the elections as well, the German chancellor, and she won one year after the crisis. She won a big conservative, neoliberal majority in Germany. So after one of the biggest failures of capitalism, the conservative and the liberals won in Germany the elections. So I think both ways are possible. In my experiences, crises are the times of government. People rally around the flag, as you Americans say, and this is what happened in Germany in the first weeks of the pandemic crisis. The conservatives gained in the polls tremendously, and at the same time, crises are times where we have to question if the roads we went in the past are the right roads of the future. So I think for me it's very helpful if I think in these crises where people tend to stick to the well-tried, to the old-fashioned, where is a need for stability, maybe also the need of a strong leader. So all things that may be more profitable for conservative parties. I always think on an old line from a famous Italian novel, The Leopard from Tommaso di Lampedusa. I don't know if you read this, but in this novel there is this very famous saying, everything must change so everything can stay the same. So I would advise maybe to focus on the dialectic of change and stability. So progressive movement in a crisis must make clear that change means stability. For example, if we don't want to go our temperature going through the roof, if we don't want floods and droughts and overwhelm us, we need to change the way we produce energy. If we don't want our healthcare system to collapse, we have to stop cutting it and paying nurses and doctors better. Just to say, I think that a message of change may not be enough to win progressive majorities in a crisis, but we have to reach out also to conservative concerns to win majorities. Maybe I'll leave it to that at the moment.
Great. Look, thank you, Robert. And I love that idea that everything must change so that things can stay the same. It's a message of both transformation, but also stability and continuity. So hopefully that's something we can come back to. I'd like to turn to Ismaël Emelien now in Paris. Ismaël, one of the things that Robert said during his remarks was that this was a moment where people were rallying around the flag. Yet France is a bit of an outlier.
If only.
France is a little bit of an outlier there. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about why that hasn't happened in France and what President Macron might be able to do, or what progressives in France might be able to do to sort of make this an opportunity confronted by those sort of challenges. And thank you for joining us as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me here. Well, indeed, the crisis did not trigger any rallying around the flag in France. And so far, it hasn't changed anything in terms of popularity or opinion of the government or the president. We are roughly where we were 5 months ago, before the crisis started. I think there are many reasons to that. One of those being that one should remember that in 2017, in the first round of the presidential election, roughly 50% of the electorate chose to vote for an extremist leader, either Jean-Luc Mélenchon on the far left or Marine Le Pen on the far right. And those people are still there, and they're still angry and disappointed with pretty much everything progressives or reasonable people might do or say. Another reason is that we experienced some very tangible problems at the beginning of the crisis related to masks and tests. And we also were one of the countries where the science, the debates, the internal debates within scientists were quite extraordinary, because we had one Nobel Prize winner in medicine saying exactly the opposite of the most famous French scientists in terms of epidemiology and biology. And he happens to be very clever and very gifted with media and communication. So all these together led to a situation where nothing actually changed in terms of popularity. We might go back to that later, but just a couple of remarks on your initial questions. I think the crisis and the crisis, both health and economic ones, have to be opportunities for us progressives, either or we leave the scenes to people that are going to do pretty much what we are seeing in Brazil, or the US, or whatever. I think we have a chance to funnel all the change people want, and I think there is a renewed mandate for change and a renewed willingness for change towards climate-related issues because of the fact that the crisis, everything we might have to do to make sure such a crisis do not come back is related to green and climate issues. Second, I think there is a room for leapfrogging in terms of a progressive action. I think we might take a 10 years or 15 years shortcuts in terms of progressive actions related to environment or European cooperation, as it happened between Chancellor Merkel and President Macron a couple of weeks ago. And when it comes to campaigning per se, because that's one of the questions you asked, I think what we saw during the crisis was just a confirmation that everything now is being disintermediated, meaning that everybody makes up his or her mind based on what he or she sees, perceives around he or she, what friends and colleagues tell them. And that means that, of course, digital will be central, but much more than that, that we need to find ways to touch people even offline, and maybe especially offline, in a direct way. And I think one of the things that could be an opportunity in that regard with the crisis was that in many areas, both geographical and sectorial, people organize themselves. For instance, we had skin doctors in France that were tired of having no answers from their official representatives, that organized a WhatsApp group, and soon there were 1,000 on WhatsApp and sharing infos and cases about patients and possible symptoms of the COVID. And they still are active and they are willing to pursue the organization. And I think it is exactly the example of some things we should build on for future campaigning.
Thanks, Ismaël. I definitely, in the second round with the panel, want to come back to how actually we can build out those innovations. So thank you for raising that. Muthoni, you're in Washington. Thanks so much for joining us. You are in a moment of profound change in the United States, unprecedented levels of protest. That are not just driven by what's happening with COVID, but sort of also deep-rooted institutional racism and the light that has been shone on that, partly through COVID, but also partly through the police brutality. Can you share with us your perspective on whether you feel this is a moment for change? What is the potential there? And again, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, absolutely, Matt, and thank you for having me. Hello to my other panelists. This is what we are looking at right now is a historic continuum, and it is a moment that we have met before. We have seen it as a part of how the United States has actualized change over time, and I think that the biggest question for us, though, that we have seen as we look sort of out over through history, from slavery to Reconstruction, and all of the things that sort of along the way, the battles that were fought, the fact that there have been race riots before, and then very incremental change. And I think that in a lot of our arenas that we are looking at, whether it's climate and some of our other spaces, that this sort of idea of incrementalism has really brought to the fore this sort of unified rage and We are particularly, I think, seeing, at least for us here in the States, so many of our protests, particularly inside of this pandemic, there were a lot of young people, and that has often been the case inside of a lot of our movements, that the age is often forgotten of these folks who are really girding the movement in the moment. And frankly, they are exacting some very important reactions and progress. But that this is, I think that is very important as we sort of think about sort of historically, that this is not an anomaly, and that as we are thinking about what has actually brought about change in the U.S., whether and the fact that this is sort of that we have seen this intersectional moment. I mean, that even began after the American Revolution. There were colonists who began to see their own story of oppression with the British, and when they were looking at enslaved people. Now, obviously, this may be signs of early privilege because the two are not exactly the same, but nonetheless, it is indicative of something that over time has been the case, and that is that we have been our most successful at moving the dial when these movements have been intersectional. We have been our slowest and most incremental when people are left alone to sort of fight in a lane all by themselves, as if the problem that we are attacking is not an American problem and is instead this group's problem or that group's problem. And what we are seeing right now is that racism and systemic oppression are being tackled as an American problem. And that is something that I don't think has been seen on this scale before. And certainly because we have the level of we're in an information age that was never available, I think, at this level during previous iterations. It is not different, I am sure, even than the difference of people seeing these videos. I mean, they have made an extreme difference in the reaction, just as they did in the Arab Spring. I mean, it made an extreme difference for people to be brought in and to have the visualization and to see the brutality in black and white right in front of them. So, and because right now we are seeing some really, I would say, monumental changes being made in a system that, if I were to walk you through the timeline of history and police force, police violence, police empowerment, frankly, and what that has all been oftentimes designed to do, the reaction that is happening now in the dismantling inside of our state and local governments, with many of our state and local leaders being right on the front lines of really critical decision making. And I think they will be important people as we think about how we move forward. They should be the people, they are the experts that we ought to be talking to, who are really negotiating in real time and themselves learning, I think, a lot from how to sort of be sort of a 360 problem solver.
Thank you, Muthoni. I'm going to come straight back to you as well, if I may, with the second round of questions, which is just to think about that actual organizing moment. Like, we are in a situation, certainly in the United States, for example, where those people who are protesting in some ways are putting their life on the line. That's what we discussed earlier this morning on a separate call. And it does raise the question: how do we use this moment? Increasingly we've transitioned towards an integrated online and offline form of campaigning. But what are the opportunities for us, actually, on a kind of tactical level, to seize this moment in a time where protest is understandable and it's very brave, but what are the other methods that are out there, whether it's about voter registration, online drives, or otherwise, where we can make that transition to maybe a safer environment, at least in the midst of a crisis?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this in a couple of ways. The first is, I'm going to start with, I like to say this a lot, my husband, who's Dutch, he says this is a Dutch saying, which is you've got to sweep your own yard first. And so I'm going to start with my yard, which is, I am sitting inside of, a political party, and we are, for the most part, our most dominant political politics get done in a two-party system. And so that is an incredibly important yard. And inside of the space that we are looking at right now, you know, I am seeing just incredible action by, again, a lot of these state and local leaders who I think are going to be very critical to helping inform kind of our way forward. But also that, you know, the level of diversity that is needed inside of our parties cannot be understated. That oftentimes the walls that we have hit and the way that we have become less relevant, frankly, in many different periods of time, is that we have lacked levels of thought leadership and actual empowerment inside of our parties. And I, as somebody who has worked inside of this for over 2 decades, I have many and tackled this from several different areas, not just race, but gender. And Matt's smiling because he knows, having worked for almost a decade trying to get more women elected, et cetera, that I don't think that we have acknowledged the strangulation on our ideas and on our progress that we have brought to ourselves as political parties when that has been our long history. And I know that, having worked with colleagues from around the world, that oftentimes political parties can be very elite places, and they are not as open as they need to be. They can be fairly closed, and in fact, a lot of us here in the States, it was been a bit of a family and friends deal, and that is what you've seen even in a lot of our major elected officials. And so as we move from that style of not just governing, frankly, but on the front end of even how ideas are generated and how we politically organize and who is helping to inform that, that has a tremendous impact on a lot of it has a legal impact on a lot of our legislation and laws that we are creating. And right now, a lot of what what this movement is tackling are they have legislative answers. And that is why they are moving these things, because they know that they have a hostile actor in the Trump government and Republican U.S. Senate here, and instead are working at the state and local level with mayors, with city councils here, to really begin to dismantle a lot of the harm that has been written into legislation and has been granted to various forces that have continued to play the role in the fact that the leading cause of death for young men in the U.S. is our police. That 1 in 1,000 Black men are killed, they can expect to be killed by a police officer. So, and a part of what has now, I think, really expanded the engagement, and why we as parties and political leaders and whatever sector you control need to start in your own yard and really dismantling and looking at what are the systematic barriers that I have around me right now. Do I have an operation that is really one that is going to be able to meet the moment? Am I the leader that is ready right now for what people need? And that leader right now is someone who has a very, very diverse leadership, thought structure around them. And so that, as we are looking at how we move forward, cannot be understated. I've been in this long enough to see it acknowledged but not acted upon. And as we think about how you manage change, the fundamentals of that, the first part of it is that you don't tackle things in a one-on-one situation. You are supposed to go at managing change in a systematic way. And when we are tackling right now, when the movement and the streets and our people are all engaged around something systematic, we have to be engaged in it in a systematic mindset.
Thank you, Muthoni. I agree 100% with those remarks. Ismaël, I'm going to come back to you now and pick up on something that Muthoni said about entrance into parties or movements often being an elitist thing. I remember a book, I think, a biography by Mayor Daley, the title of which was "Nobody That Nobody Sent," and it relates to the first meeting that he went to of a Democratic Party in Chicago many decades ago, when people said to him, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm nobody." And he's like, "Who sent you?" And he said, "Nobody." And the precinct captain said, "Well, we don't want nobody that nobody sent." And it sort of spoke in some ways to the, I mean, obviously the Democratic Party and the progressive movement in the United States is in a very different place now. And thankfully so, but it did spoke to that sort of exclusivity about how people felt that they could get engaged in politics. So Ismaël, I'd like to come to you and to pick up on those themes about that Muthoni raised and say, and if you could tell us a little bit about how En Marche was organized in that way. You know, like you made it a movement that anybody could come to. It was a movement that in some ways the empowerment of the supporters was more important than the empowerment of the leader. If you could talk us through that, and then, you know, like how there may be lessons there for progressive parties more generally about how we're going to do politics in the future in a sort of post-COVID environment, or just generally as the need to organize in a different way becomes ever greater.
Sure. Well, I couldn't agree more with what Muthoni just said. And actually, we had no choice when we started our march, because we had no money, no elected officials, no network, no implementation on the territory and in the countryside, and nothing, no salaries, nobody. And so we had to offer something that would give people motivation to join rather than staying on their couch watching Netflix. And we are lucky enough to start something at a time and in a political landscape where all the other traditional parties were actually disappointing their own supporters and members. And in a way where in pretty much every other political organization, everything was organized to initiate and replicate power dynamics in every level. So at the very local level, you had to seize the committee or the section or whatever the nuclear cell of the party was called. And then going up, you had to stand for one candidate for the city, and then for the department, and then for the region, and then for the nomination, and then for the presidential election. We decided to do exactly the opposite. And so we welcomed everybody with one condition, which was they needed to sign on a very tough and aggressive chart of values and principles, where pretty much every other charts were very vague and hollow so that anybody could apply. Ours was very clear. For instance, it was just after a kind of political traumatism related to the reform of the labor market and months of protests and violences in the streets. And we started by saying that we thought this was not enough, and we would have to go back to reform really the labor market. And that was the only condition asked for the people. And they also were welcome, even though they were actually members of other parties. And that was very new, and it was a way for us to put the problem inside of the other organizations, because we were confident that there were progressives pretty much everywhere, and we just intended to become the first movement that was 100% progressive. And everything we did and organized and provided them with along the way, in the first month and then during the campaign, was consistent with that claim. And one example, but we have many, was the way we asked them to organize. Anybody could start a local committee, which was our nuclear cell, anywhere. Around nearby his home or his workstation or his vacation house or whatever. Anybody could start a local committee and became by default the leader of the committee. And anybody else could join the same committee. And in order to avoid all the power struggles within every cell of the parties that other organizations suffered from, we developed a little button on the website that allowed anybody that was dissatisfied with the way his or her leader was leading the committee to just leave the committee and start another one next door. Meaning that if you had a sense that the leader was not committed enough, or had a hidden agenda, or was doing nothing, or was doing bad things, whatever, well, we asked you to leave the committee, take as many people with you as you want, and start another one next door. That meant that we spent exactly 0 seconds, and we had nobody watching over local struggles and conflicts. And we had at the peak of the campaign around 4,000 committees, ranging from 3 people to 500, depending on the geography. And one very important lesson we drew from the campaign is that you need to trust your people every step of the way, and especially when times are tough. And the worst week of the campaign was the week when our candidate voluntarily, it wasn't a conscious thing, but started 2 different polemics, 2 different scandals that hit us very hard in the press. One about colonization and one about gay marriage. And instantly we lost a couple of points in the polls, and a wind of panic started to blow on the campaign in the headquarters and pretty much everywhere. And when that happened in other organizations, they would say, well, we have internal polls saying that things are not as bad as they appear, and we know that on the ground things are going very well, and it's on the press mistaking that for a big problem where it's not. And we see that algorithm on Facebook are proof that we speak about us very positively or whatever. And we decided to do exactly the opposite. So we gathered everybody physically in the headquarters. So there was like 500 persons, and it was displayed, streamed live on Facebook. And we apologized in the name of on behalf of the candidate, saying, well, we made your week tougher and your job tougher, and that's only on us, and we are sorry for that, and we are gonna fix that in that way and in this way, and that's how we are going to rebound from that. And actually, that display of trust was obvious afterwards, because nobody knows better how things are going than people on the ground. They are the ones handing out leaflets and knocking on doors, and they know if people are angry or not with the campaign and with the candidate. And so just thinking with them about what exactly happened was a very powerful fuel for them to go out again and try and regain the people we had lost over the campaign. And so every step of the way, our only priority was not the press. It was not the competition with the other candidates. It was our people. And the most important dashboard we had was one that displayed everything happening inside our committees, and adding everything from a debate somewhere to a door knocking session to whatever. And every week of the campaign, up until the very last week, the number of events increased as regard to the week before. So we knew that every week of the campaign we were on the right track as regards to our people. I don't know if that answers your question, Matt.
No, it does, because I think it speaks to the philosophy of the approach underneath the campaign, as well as the way in which it was organized to sort of integrate online and offline campaigning and make it as easy to, basically what you're saying is your people are your best resources, and empower them and trust them as much as you can. Yeah. And I think, Anna, that would be a good moment to bring you in. You led a reform of the Liberal Party of Canada, which basically made it free to join the party, and led to a massive surge in membership of people who became more and more engaged, both at a time when you needed to raise funds, but also to knock more doors, make more calls, and engage in campaigning. So I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about your experience of transforming. Ismaël's experience is one of building a new party. Yours is one of transforming an existing party that at the time was often sort of characterized as the quintessential backroom deal party, yet you turned it into a modern movement. How did you do that?
Well, it's a long story. It took many years. We weren't quite as efficient or as in some ways as the Marche example, but we had similarly great people right across the country ready to roll up their sleeves and get to work. And I think, you know, it does go back to the elections prior to 2015 when Prime Minister Trudeau was elected, which was a clear message also from Canadians that they had lost touch with the party. They were not connected to the party, didn't represent them, and they made that clear on election day, and that's something that we had to listen to and take as our starting point in terms of taking this 125-plus-year-old national party and rethinking it for modern campaigns and for a young leader. And so I think that when I look back to 2015, we had already started that opening up. The president of the party prior to me had introduced this supporter clause, which, so at that time we had a membership, which had a small fee associated, but then we opened it up to supporters, basically folks who wanted to hear what we were doing and participate, including in the election of the party leader. And that did grow participation tremendously in the party into the hundreds of thousands. I think people signed up to be supporters and participate in that leadership vote. And so then, you know, in an era where we need to grow and learn digital, this 2014, 2015, we had to look at that group of engaged and interested people and figure out how to keep them engaged and empower them and give them the tools and the training necessary to help us cross the finish line. We were in third place at that time with, I think, 38 seats. And so it was quite a leap on election day to find ourselves in a clear majority with 184 seats. And that has tremendously to do with, you know, the focus the party put on its people and training and empowering the people to right across the country in all ridings to get out there and knock on doors and organize events. And so that success in some ways came despite a very old infrastructure in our party, a 90-page constitution, provincial constitutions, a lot of little fiefdoms here and there, and entrenched, you know, folks, some of whom really got on board with our changes and some of whom were not so sure. And so we had an opportunity in the wake of the election to take that momentum and the positive energy that was coming our way from Canadians and to say, look, we're not just gonna sit back and say we won the election the way the party is. We made the decision to change the party and get rid of that constitution, and in a very short period towards our next convention, through a series of national consultations and a number of exercises, very dedicated volunteers and lawyers, we redrafted down to a 19-page document and really streamlined the whole structure of the party. And a lot of the parties are things that, you know, we've talked about a little bit earlier, some of the other speakers, like how do we ensure diversity in the leadership of our party? How do we ensure we're reaching out to communities? We're so proud of our multiculturalism here, but, you know, where are all those cultures and communities and new Canadians, and are they with us? And if not, why? So we had to be proactive in recruiting women, and the new document, the new approach had to reflect that need to be flexible, the need to reach out and to take away barriers like the membership fee, to get rid of that completely, and at the same time, expand the on-ramps, grow those opportunities for engagement. And I would use our policy process as an example of that. Now it's in online, it's accessible to anyone who wants to participate. It's an ongoing process. And so the ideas that are being generated across the country are happening constantly leading up to our convention every 2 years, but it is open for Canadians to engage and participate in the party. And, you know, my other view, I kept going to the young people in our party through that process of rewriting the Constitution and asking them what they saw, you know, what they needed and where they saw things were going, because, you know, my motivation was in part to leave something for the next generation that they would want to use, that they would feel compelled to organize within, that they would feel they had a role in and a voice in. And, you know, Prime Minister Trudeau can do all sorts of great things, but if we don't have another generation coming up behind us ready to pick up the tools and keep advancing progressive ideas and doing that hard work of door to door, you know, we could only get so far. So engaging young people was a priority for me, and really just keeping the focus on where are the barriers and how do we get rid of them, and where are the on-ramps and how do we expand them. And the document, Matt, that you posted earlier with the article that Braden Cayley and I drafted for that pamphlet goes into a little bit more detail and all that. I don't want to, as I said, it took a long time. It was many years, so I could probably talk a lot about this, but hopefully that hits some of the notes that you're looking for this purpose, this panel.
Absolutely, and I mean, and it's actually directly responded to one of the questions from a member of the audience that I've been given by the chat feed, which is, you know, like, how do you create that more open movement without starting from scratch? So I think that's valuable, and I would just say to anyone who's watching right now, please, you know, interested in that kind of argument, then please, can you make sure that you go and read that document, because what the argument that you and Braden and the story that you and Braden lay out in that piece is really very compelling. I'll come back to Robert now. And Robert, when we started when we had a prep call earlier this week, you know, you were at pains to talk about how the need to be more open, the need to integrate online and offline in a sort of post-COVID world was nothing new. This has been a transition that had been going on for a long period of time, alongside the need to, you know, empower those people who were supporting you. So I'd welcome right now you sharing your views on how the German Greens have done that, and what the lessons are that other progressives might be able to learn from the experience that you've had during that process.
Let me start with saying that these are really political times in Germany, and this sounds more obvious than it is, because 10 years ago, these were not political times in Germany, because Angela Merkel was putting the country to sleep by leveling all political differences. Wolfgang Schmidt will probably remember these times. And at the moment, all parties in Germany are more politicized, and also it's easier for us to gain support. Speaking for my own party, the Greens have almost doubled their membership in the last couple of years. We're now more than 100,000 members. And this has probably nothing to do with digital tools, but with now having issues which, like the climate change issue, the Fridays for Future movement, that we have two charismatic leaders at the moment, which have a very positive effect to our supporters, that the party is more unified than it used to be, and that we communicate change issues not as threats, but as chances, and so on. But to go to your question, has the pandemic changed something has the pandemic changed the way we make campaigns, we organize campaigns? I don't think that it has changed it fundamentally, but there have been changes, because during the pandemic, during the lockdown, many people, maybe every people, almost everyone in Germany has been forced to learn digital tools. When I was sent home in the first weeks of lockdown, I had to make childcare with my little daughter. My little daughter and my grandmother were playing board games via Skype, for example, something which has not been imaginable before. And at the same time, after a couple of Skype games, they thought it sucks. It didn't really work, because the physical experience of sitting next to each other and playing was missing. And this is maybe how I would describe the challenges for campaigning. I'm a person who was enforcing digital change within my party for years now, and I was also very enthusiastic on digital tools. But my major learning is that the campaigning at the end is something between people, and it has to be between people from face to face. So integrated campaigning for me means that you have to have an app for knocking door to door, for example, that you collect donations both via canvassing, via letter, but also via email, that you combine social media strategy with press strategy. So there is maybe the pandemic has made it easier for people in Germany, also for campaigning, to use digital tools, and has also improved our way of using digital tools. But at the end, I'm convinced campaigning is something which has to be integrated and has to be in Germany we say analog. I don't know what the word is, but from face to face at the end. It's about people, and it's about real meetings, physical moments in a way.
Great, thank you for that, Robert, and I agree. Politics is always about people to people, neighbor to neighbor, peer to peer, and I think you're right on that. But as I think about this sort of digital campaigning moment and the integration, I'm sort of struck that maybe we're entering a new era of digital campaigning. In some ways, Jeremy Hyman's from Purpose, he has a great analogy where he talks about the movement from a kind of Tetris digital campaign to a Minecraft. And Tetris, of course, is a digital online platform, but the block falls down from the bottom, and your goal is to make sure it fits in with what's already there. Whereas Minecraft is something that you build up and organize from the bottom up, and those people who engage can create and organize their own way of campaigning. And I found that kind of a striking way of thinking about that. And I think as we empower more people to build the movements they need to do, maybe that's the kind of philosophy that can enthuse us. Right, I'm going to stop now with the questions that I lead, and I'm going to try and start bringing people in from the discussant room. We have some great discussants in the room: Tom Pitfield, Wolfgang Schmidt, Braden Cayley, and others. So you guys, if you feel like you want to raise a question to the panelists, then please use the chat facility and mention that, because we're going to open this up a little bit now. But first of all, I'd like to go to Marcus Roberts, who is the Director of International Projects at YouGov, the polling firm. Marcus, I know that you had a question that you sent to me via text earlier on, so please, the floor is yours, and welcome.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Muthoni, and everyone else. That was a really great set of presentations. I spent a lot of my time working with candidates, clients, campaigns, trying to think about how to put back together that traditional progressive coalition of blue-collar workers as well as middle-class voters, of some lower income white voters, along with ethnic minority voters, women and men, trying to get the whole of the coalition of our liberal left family back together. And that's why the politics of the moment that we're in at the moment, I find very challenging to think about. And so my question or rather ask for help from all of you, please, is this. Right now, it seems that so many hard right politicians want our politics to be about who disagrees with who on transgender bathrooms, whether or not the Winston Churchill statue is a statue to a racist, whether you're in favor of law and order, being the police, or whether you're in favor of protests in the streets. Now, obviously, this is a very bad politics and a very bad series of choices that the far right are trying to make us go down. But how do we avoid the culture war traps that the far right and the hard right politicians are setting for us, whilst at the same time being true to our social justice missions, and indeed winning over the voters that might be in the middle, say the Obama-Trump Democrats of Midwest states from 2016, whilst at the same time pursuing that politics of social justice? Thanks a lot for helping with my headache.
Marcus, thanks for that excellent question and for taking the time to join us today. As no one on the panel is prepared to do that, I'm just going to do a random pick. And Ismaël, your screen is the one that comes up most. So I'm going to go to you first, but I am warning everybody that you're all going to have to answer that at some point. So Ismaël, the floor is yours.
Well, it's a tough question. I have a couple of remarks. First, I do not believe that the objective should be to rebuild the traditional coalition. Especially in France, it happens that the problems we have, objective problems we have of social justice are not about income distribution, it's about opportunities distribution. And actually, the inequalities in terms of income have not shifted a lot since it was De Gaulle sitting in the Élysée. But what's changed ever since was that at the time, the blue-collar worker could become a white-collar worker, and that is much more difficult today. So I do believe that people are less and less likely to vote according to their social class. And that the goal of a political progressive campaign should be to provide an offer and make sure that this offer is heard, and then build the majority of a project, and not the other way around, the project of a majority. Second remark, I think, and this is very true, that we are most of the time too reasonable and too naive when it comes to political fight. And we are very willing and very often falling in the traps that are being set up in front of us by populists of various kinds. And I think we should not hesitate to rephrase the questions ourselves. And so every time we are attacked on cultural changes, we should try and replicate in a way that speaks directly to the people. And for instance, I don't know, the way we decided to give an answer to the question of the statues in France was to say, well, there will not be any statue taken down, because everything that has been statued is part, by definition, of our history, and we're not gonna rewrite that. And I think the next step is to try and find a very offensive argument towards the populists. And I think, coming back to what we discussed earlier, that climate change issues are a very weak spot for them, and it so happens that it is a growing preoccupation for and concern for the people. I don't know if that's a good answer to you, and I hope it will ease your headache, but I'm not sure.
Well, we shall see, Ismaël. We shall see. Robert, I'm going to go to you next, because I'm going to be chivalrous and give the ladies on the panel slightly longer to prepare their answer. So Robert, the floor is yours.
Well, Marcus said something about the cultural war trap, as far as I understood. Yeah, I know what you mean. I think you mentioned gender toilets, huh? For example. Nevertheless, I would say we should not be afraid of strongly and without compromises defending the values of open society and minority rights. I'm one of the persons who think that we right populists are not defeated by copying their agenda or trying to do this. The conservatives in Germany have tried this, they failed, and I think they learned from it. But you have a point. I think that we should not exaggerate this. And the statue issue you mentioned is a good issue, I think. We also discussed this Monday, this issue of statues. And I also would say that statues are part of our history, and tearing them down is not a good idea. People, on the other hand, there are streets in Germany who are named after racists, colonial suppressors, even fascist issues. There is in Berlin, there is a Spanische Allee, which is renamed by the Legion Condor, which has bombed Spanish cities during the Civil War in Spain. And in our opinion, we should discuss renaming streets. So it's not easy. On the one hand, be very clear and be very clear in the fight for open society, but use the right battles and not the wrong ones. And I think the statues issue is a very, very good example. This is a wrong, in my opinion, a wrong battle to choose.
Great, thank you, Robert. Anna, how are the culture wars playing out in Canada?
Well, the culture wars, I mean, I think that when it comes to bringing people together and motivating to have a message that resonates, sometimes the things that, I mean, we call it a little bit here, occasionally you hear the reference to the Ottawa bubble. There are things that tend to take up a lot of space in certain political circles or folks who are really perhaps more engaged. And I would even go back to, I think that there was a stat early on in Canada of maybe 10% of Canadians had been members of a political party, you know, around 2015 or something like that. So I think you have to go up in terms of kind of looking at what the things are in people's day-to-day life that matter to them. Do they have a job? Are they able to feed their kids? Do they have safe childcare? Do they have safe transportation to get to work? These other things can kind of distract, and it's not that they're not important. I just think if you're talking about what you're asking is, how do I bring this together, and how do I unify people under you know, a certain vision? I think the values message mentioned earlier was also absolutely critical to the starting point of all that, and then you apply those values to the issues. But it's also important to just actually break through and ignore some of the noise sometimes, and just continue to focus on the things that matter to your voters and to the people that you want to serve, if you're a political party, for example, or someone running for office. And, you know, I think you have to be prepared to address those things in a scrum and a day-to-day, you know, news cycle situation, but keep going back to the economic question that you're trying to answer. In our case, in 2015, we were focused on cutting taxes for the wealthiest Canadians and reducing them for middle-class Canadians. And I think that finding those key things that are, you know, what people are really worried about, the bread and butter stuff, and focusing on them and coming back to that, you will find people want to hear your answers to those big things, and they're going to want to know, you know, what the direction is that you would like to take on that. And I mean, that would be my suggestion anyway, to have those big strokes and that big picture stuff in place, and to just keep going back to it.
Thanks, Muthoni. I'm not sure whether you are still with us, and if you are, I hope you can come in on this issue too, because clearly the culture wars is obviously something, a position that Trump is edging for. It's been the foundation of the way that he not only ran his campaign 3.5, 4 years ago, but also in many ways how he's governed. And I think it'd be very important for us all to hear your views on how this is playing out and what to do about it.
Can you hear me? Because my screen is frozen, but hopefully you can still hear my voice.
We can still hear you perfectly, Muthoni.
Okay, great. So, I mean, the thing that is connecting us right now in the US is that this very president who you've just mentioned is the very same person who has, frankly, put a lot of us more in the same boat than ever, same categories, more similarities now around the abject misery that he has brought to this country, having reduced the role of working people, even as, you know, he is, yes, able to communicate in a way that still appeals to a small sector, but a much larger sector of those same people who may have voted for him the first time around have already demonstrated a degree of change that has only continued, I think, to move away from him in the 2018 midterm elections here in the US, and even in our 2019 elections that took place for some of our governors and in some of our special elections that we've had for the US House, et cetera. He has reduced the role of people of color. He has reduced protections of women. We have really and truly one of our largest threats looming that, you know, is sort of still sitting in the background a bit right now because there's so much else. There are other conversations that have grown louder. But in the middle of this pandemic, in the middle of COVID, we still had Republicans trying to repeal and replace people's Obamacare, their healthcare system here. We have a lot of very salient and pressing kitchen table economic issues that link us together in a way that even his vitriol and this culture war that he has been waging since the very beginning begins to really lose some of a lot of its power over the fact that he has a soaring unemployment rate that he, yes, tried to brag about because the jobs report was less bad than had previously been predicted, and yet we are in the middle of a recession. We are in a pandemic where because of his irresponsible reopening around COVID, that we are now seeing the rates of coronavirus raise again in critical battleground states, frankly, if we are going to have an electoral conversation. And so the fact that we have people in states like Arizona and Florida and Wisconsin starting to see rates higher, some of the highest rates they've seen in a while, this is going to have real world impact. And I absolutely agree with Ismaël that we cannot have, as leaders, romantic language about the past. Everyone has not experienced what many have sort of made the language of our parties, the language of cooperation, the language of collaboration. And there is a reason why there is this global rage that is being executed in so many places. There is a relatability to the oppression and the systematic racism that we as Black people in the United States and so many other people of color in particular have experienced. And that happened with and inside of our politics. And it has happened, there is a cost to the ignorance that has even existed inside of our decision-making spaces, and going back again to future and forward-looking and how we are going to make decisions. And when we are being given the awesome responsibility of leadership, who are we talking to? Symbols are a statement, and they are exaltations of people who did exist inside of a country's history. I think that there is it is a really important discussion that has to be had and should be had around diverse circles of people, around what you are going to do as we move forward. But I am sure as hell not wanting to send my kid to a school that has been named after a slave owner. So there are very personal pieces to these discussions that may not live in your personal lived experience, but that you, as you look to lead and expand and be given the awesome responsibility of speaking for others and speaking for a collaborative future, then you need to make sure that we are together, that our decisions have been informed by many of the people who will understand better than we sort of these different sides of the arguments and the different sides of the decision-making that need to take place.
Muthoni, thank you so much as ever for that articulate and passionate response. I'm going to now move to Wolfgang Schmidt, who has told me that he has a comment rather than a question, and then on to Sabrina. So Wolfgang, please do share your thoughts with us.
Yeah, maybe also on Marcus' question, just a short remark. I think we had it from Muthoni and from Anna, and we need to combine that as progressives, because I think obviously the activists, our party members, but to be honest, also the Twitter bubble, for us, these issues are very important. And for a certain sector of our electorate as well, but for many of those who we need to vote for us, they are not. And so what we need to do is to somehow bring this together. And if we look at why we lost, and why we lost also to the right wing and to populist parties, is because they had a feeling that elections and what we were talking about were not about them. And we need to find and identify the issues. And I think the COVID crisis will and might help us in this regard, that actually what is going to happen has an impact on everybody's life. And we as progressives, we need to identify these issues and address these issues so that people actually have a reason to go to vote. Because if we're honest, many of the issues that we were discussing about don't really address everybody's lives. And this might be a special situation for Germany, obviously, with Angela Merkel now leaving. We had a phase very different to the US of what you could say it's depoliticized debate. It was kind of a sleepwalking. And now it will be interesting. What we need to do is bring up the differences and distinguish the different parties so that people know that this is actually fight. That might sound strange to the US, where you have the completely different situation, but this is the situation for us. And my question and my concern, or what I'd like to discuss with other friends of the progressive movement is, okay, this crisis that is shaking up everybody and shaking up the economy and having a lasting impact on everything, how can we make sure that we don't lose this momentum for progressive answers, as I think we did with the great crisis of 2008 and 2009. And that is something that I think would be interesting to discuss among this group and others.
Great, thank you so much, Wolfgang. I am going to bring in Sabrina Schultz now, and then Roger Casale to share their views. Sabrina, the floor is yours.
Brilliant, thank you. Just to identify myself, I'm a policy fellow with the Progressive Center. My comment actually builds up really nicely on what Wolfgang just said. I wonder if we're not missing a trick, actually. How come that so many issues as civil society brought very close to the center of politics? I'm thinking of the Fridays for Future movement. I'm also thinking of the anti-racism movement. How come we are not joining forces with them? Why are we not identifying allies and civil society and organized civil society to build on this momentum, to actually derive political messages, to derive concrete policies from this sheer force and put it into platforms for elections? You know, is this not the natural thing to do, to reach out to very broad range of progressive actors who are organized and energized already?
Thank you, Sabrina. And Roger, please do share your question with us as well, which is one that's very dear to my own heart.
Great, thank you very much, Matt, and thanks everyone for a very inspiring, energizing discussion. And perhaps I just answer Sabrina's question with one word. As somebody who leads a civil society organization, New European Civil Rights Organization, and also vice president of the European Civic Forum, my answer is a resounding yes. Politics must get closer to civil society. Civil society wants to get closer to politics. But yeah, my question is this. Yesterday was the 4th anniversary of the murder of the British MP, Jo Cox, who once said, "We have more in common than divides us." And I wonder whether the panel think that that statement was true then, well, perhaps for history. More importantly, is it true today, particularly in the heart of the COVID crisis? And if it is true, what does that say to us? What does that tell us about how we come out of the crisis in terms of the possibility of generating a consensus, a broader consensus around big social change? One issue I'm thinking of is issues in relation to inequality, such as a universal basic income, which it seems to be much more popular this side of the COVID epidemic starting than it was before. And there are probably others. Sabrina's mentioned too, the Fridays for Future movement and the anti-racist movement. Is there an opportunity for big change? Is it, and does it come from the insight that Jo Cox had, that actually, you know, in the heat of this crisis, we realize that we really do have more in common than divides us?
Thank you very much, Roger. And that is a message that touches me as well, and we all miss Joe an incredible amount, and it's wonderful that this sort of global discussion about progressive futures is taking place so close to the anniversary of her passing. It's very, very fitting. I mean, for me, those questions are all very interlinked, which is basically like, how do we build a bigger coalition? How do we come together to advance progressive ends? We only have 10 minutes of this panel left. And the reason we only have 10 left is because we've got a fantastic panel that will follow us with Joschka Fischer and Madeleine Albright. So those of you who are watching, please, whatever you do after this fantastic panel is finished, do not end. But what I would like to do then is now turn to each of my panelists and give them a minute and a half each to answer those broad questions, which is really like, how do we build that progressive coalition to come together with civil society, with people across progressive traditions, and make sure that we don't miss the opportunity that we probably did in 2008. In 2008, progressives came together to stop the world going over the cliff. We won that battle, but we lost the war. This time we need to make sure we win the war. I'm going to go to Muthoni, if she is still with us, to answer that first, and then I will work backwards from there. Muthoni, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. And two wonderful questions also from Sabine. So I would just say this, to take it from what may feel a bit rudimentary, but from my own sort of space. The way that my teams are organized, they are organizing in a very intersectional way. My labor political director works very closely with AFAM, with our Native American, with our AAPI, our Asian American, with our Latinx political director. Our rural political director is working closely. So I will give you an example that she and our African American political director together went and organized in North Carolina, in the eastern part of the state, that is our more rural part of the state. And out of that visit, we then were able to do some talent identification as well for other local organizers who we were able to help get hired into what will be the general election campaign. That is just a tiny slice of what I am trying to illustrate about how we lead, how we organize inside of our own infrastructures. How are we instructing our teams to do this work? And our most powerful outcomes have been when our teams have worked closely together, and they love doing it, and they have learned so much from one another on a consistent basis. We help infuse one another's ideas in ways that we have already been given the feedback that this has just felt like a different engagement with the party. The second thing I would say to that is something that I said earlier, Matt, and I know I keep saying it, but I am watching the example of our state elected officials and many of our local elected officials who are in deep conversation with the activists, and that that some of the lesser desired outcomes came when people weren't doing that, and some of the best outcomes are coming from more of that engagement, that approach, and that we are seeing cities and states and even small towns that are coming up with, they are coming together in ways that are a lot more inclusive and sort of less top down and far more of a collaborative process around really thinking through each of the pieces. Again, when you are in a time where we are tackling systematic change, and we can't get to the other conversations until we are acknowledging that we are in a time that is demanding systematic change, that this is a critical part of the approach to how we are going to lead.
Thank you so much, Muthoni. Anna Gainey in Montreal, please do share your thoughts with us too.
I think that, well, in our situation at the moment, we have in government, we have a progressive government. We have a very progressive prime minister who has tried very hard and been successful in a number of fronts to, to push the progressive agenda and values, and he's done that by example, and he's done that in a variety of ways on gender and economic equality. So there's a huge amount of engagement happening through government, through our ministers, and you know, working with unions, working with civil society. And so we have that position now that we're able to bring folks in through that you know, that position that we're in. And I think that this government's been very active on that front, and it's yielded a lot of success, especially in the short term just behind us, in responding to COVID, and really listening to small business, really listening to people across the country in terms of what was needed to help people through this crisis, and then really pushing the bureaucracy to move much more quickly on big things that we wouldn't normally see happen so fast in our system. And so at this time, I think, you know, on the party side, we just have to kind of keep, you know, broadcasting that message and showing the work that we're doing, and, you know, how it translates into how we organize, and the messaging that we give, and the training we give to our volunteers, who are now not knocking on doors, who are making a lot of phone calls. They're doing virtual days of action instead of days of action on the street, and that empowers them. You know, our people, when our volunteers and our organizers, you know, see a government that they're proud of, they're able to take that message and spread it in their community and build those relationships. And I think that's, you know, for us, that's what the party is going to keep doing, that, to keep working alongside the government and supporting its work, and empowering our volunteers and our teams across the country to share that message and make sure everyone's hearing it, and also to receive feedback and to receive criticism or to receive input. And there's a big chunk of that ahead. Obviously, we're not looking at an election anytime too soon, but you know, I think it's going to be really important to talk to doctors who have moved the bulk of their practice, like family doctors, online. And this was something there was so much resistance to, for privacy reasons, for regulatory reasons, and now they're just doing it because we have to do it. And so I think there's a huge opportunity to empower our volunteers with the important task of getting that feedback from civil society, from all kinds of different groups, and to let them know that we're listening. And we want to know what their experience has been, what has worked and what hasn't, and what kind of things we could maybe push through, bringing it back to the beginning, Matt, your conversation of, you know, is this an opportunity for change? And I think it is, but I think we need to hear from people. We need to, you know, that has to come from, you know, what people are looking for from the government in the next chapter post that. So that's what I think our folks will be doing, both in government and on the party side, as we continue to manage the health crisis and hopefully an economic recovery as well on the horizon.
Thank you very much, Anna. Ismaël.
Well, I would have two quick advices. One would be to go straight for the people and not the structures that try to organize them. One example, what happened with George Floyd in the US, parallel rallies in France around a similar case that happened 4 years ago. And there were two rallies launched by different people. One was actually unorganized, just an event on Facebook. You could join and show up. And 20,000 people showed up in Paris. And a few days later, another one was organized by every anti-racism NGO, and some of them are very aware, known of every French people, every French citizen, and only 1,000 people showed up. So I think, first of all, we should aim for the people directly. And second advice, and I think one way of doing so is to go above and beyond politics and offer people outcomes that are not only testimonial, not only postural, but actual actions that are going to make a difference at their hands on the issues they care about, and not waiting for a campaign to start, for an election to be won, for power to settle, to actually start making a difference in a community or in a neighborhood. So basically, I'd say that we need to act and think in a way that civil society is not something that is being exterior to politics, but become more civil society ourselves in some kind of way.
Ismaël, thank you very much. And And Robert, I'm going to leave the last word to you.
Well, maybe the key maybe to follow Joe Cox and to focus what divides and what unites us, and instead of divides us. And I think a progressive movement is well advised not to watch society as a binary system, conservative bloc, progressive bloc. In Germany, there are vast majorities for progressive issues, for climate change, for investing in education and healthcare, for protecting civil rights, for reducing social inequality. And the majorities for these issues reach widely into the middle of society. And the Green Party, we try to build alliances around issues instead of following an ideology. So conservative voters can be addressed with environmental issues. Liberal voters can be addressed with civil rights issues. Social democratic voters can be addressed with social inequality issues. So this is our focus, is really to reach out to in the center of society and try to build alliances around issues instead of ideology.
Robert, thank you for that, and I think that's a great place to end. How we concentrate on what we have in common rather than what divides us, I think, is an important thing for progressives to think about. And I'd like to thank personally Das Progressive Zentrum for providing us that opportunity to talk through these issues. Pulling something like this together is incredibly difficult. So thanks, to Alexandra Schmidt at the Center for American Progress in our team for helping me be part of this, but also to Michael Miebig, to Dominic Schwickart, to Maria Scora, and to Florian Raft. I've probably butchered a whole set of very very Germanic names that have now been pronounced in an Anglo-Saxon way. But I think the work you've done in pulling us all together for this discussion is invaluable. I thank you for that. I thank you to all the speakers who joined, and to all of you who've taken the time to watch today. Thank you. Please do enjoy the debate between Secretary Albright and Joschka Fischer, your former Vice Chancellor and Foreign Secretary. Thank you all, and good night, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are.
Good night.